In our last lecture, we examined the English tradition of liberty. We saw three great epochs in the history of liberty in England: the age of the Anglo-Saxons, the Middle Ages with its contributions of Parliament and the common law and Magna Carta, and the third epoch, the 17th century, the Puritan Revolution of Oliver Cromwell and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the introduction of the reign of liberty with the dominance of Parliament. Now, these events of the 17th century resounded across the Atlantic. And the very age of the championing of English liberty in the 17th century was the age of the creation of British North America. 1607, when Parliament was beginning to feel uneasy about James's pretensions to divine right. Jamestown was founded. The Plymouth Bay Colony. And with these colonies, these English ideals of liberty and their institutions were transported. These were free Englishmen, as they saw, and English women, who came out of their own accord to settle this new land. So already in 1619, we find in Virginia the first meeting of what would become the legislative body of Virginia, a constitutional assembly. On the Mayflower, a compact was made for orderly government in a written fashion, a constitution. And these Englishmen believed that they were entitled to every one of these great hallmarks of freedom. And they championed this idea in the New World. In fact, they weren't even sure that they were under the control of Parliament. Had they not been sent out on their own accord? And was their only attachment not to the crown? It was this belief that they were Englishmen, following the path of Englishmen who had stood up for Magna Carta, who had beheaded one king, driven another from his throne, and demanded a Bill of Rights as the price of accepting royal rule. It was following in this tradition that the men and women of 1775 and 1776 inaugurated that next great chapter in the history of liberty, the American Revolution. And I would ask you to begin this part of our course as we began the first lecture with a battle. As we began with Marathon and the free men of Athens standing up against the hirelings of a despot, so we begin today with April the 19th, the pre-dawn darkness in Lexington, Massachusetts. And 77 militiamen, Englishmen, assembled to resist the troops of the king carrying out a lawful mission. Now these Englishmen, standing there on the green at Lexington, knew full well that constitutionally the king could send his troops out on this mission. They were under his orders. They were different from the men at Marathon in that they were not fighting a foreign power. They were not resisting an attempt at occupation by an alien force. These were the king's soldiers, and they were the most prosperous, these 77 men representing these colonies. They were the most prosperous and most free people on earth. And the Constitution of England was admired on the continent by Montesquieu as the single constitution which had as its sole end liberty. They were subjects of the freest country on earth. And yet they had come out to resist the king's soldiers. The night before, the military and civil governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, in general well disposed to the Americans, but now under strict orders from London to make them obey, because resistance in the colonies to the lawful orders of the king had reached the pitch of rebellion. From the point of view of George III, the Americans were causing a great deal of trouble for one reason: they did not want to pay their taxes. That is what it came down to. And starting in 1764, they had brought up every means of resisting reasonable taxation. They had denied the right of Parliament to tax them, and now stood in violation of a clear act by Parliament in 1766 declaring its right to legislate for Englishmen everywhere. Moreover, attempts by the Crown to conciliate the Americans had only met with more resistance, reaching the point of riot when boxes of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor, the destruction of private property, so that even British merchants who in the past had sided with the Americans because of American trade now were strong in urging the Crown and Lord North's government to stand up to the Americans. And so Thomas Gage, under strong orders from London to be forceful with the Americans, gathering information, had determined that the Americans had stored in the town of Concord, as well as in Worcester, cannon. Now, these were not hunting pieces. These were not for sporting. These were cannons and other weapons that had as their only purpose to kill the king's soldiers. And so, he had sent a force of 700 men under Colonel Francis Smith, with second in command Major John Pitcairn, some of the best troops stationed in the colonies, had sent them on the mission to collect these unlawful weapons. Word of this had reached the American Security Council, for each colony had a council of security that was nothing more than an illegal body to resist the lawful orders of the king. Word had reached them. The question was, would the king's troops go to Concord or to Worcester? If they went to Worcester, they would march out by land. If they went to Concord, they would sail across Boston Harbor and land, march through the nearby towns and out to Concord, passing first through Lexington. And so to watch them, one of the members of this Committee of Safety, Paul Revere, had left the message that in the Old North Church, lanterns were to be hung, signaling whether they went by land or by sea. And the message had come. The British troops were crossing by water under the prow of great British warships and landing, so their march was to Concord. And Revere had already been underway by 11 o'clock that night, riding through the small towns on his way first to Lexington and then to Concord. In Lexington, where other members of the Committee of Safety, like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, were waiting for word of what the British governor would do. Now, these troops, as they marched along and past midnight, were drawn from the lowest orders of British society. They were professional soldiers. To become a British soldier meant generally that you had failed in ordinary life, or that you were simply hungry. And the recruiting stations held out a big sign of a side of beef, meaning at least you ate on a regular level. While you might have been almost impressed there in a bar, having drinks bought for you, and then the man seated next to you in civilian clothes would give you a shilling and say, "Look, go buy rounds for everybody." You took that shilling and suddenly he announced, "You're now the king's. You've taken the king's shilling." And so you were drilled and beaten, the harshest possible discipline. But at the end, you were a soldier. And these were proud soldiers serving in proud regiments, fully conscious that they were doing their duty. But they were tired. First of all, they had to be rowed across. Then they had been kept waiting for an hour while their colonels sit back for rations, not understanding that they already had rations. So they got their rations, threw them away, and then to begin to march. Crossing a small creek, their feet now wet, their socks rubbing blisters on their feet. So they are irritated, sleepy, angry as they approach Lexington and find these 77 men assembled there to meet them. These are militiamen. They are part of a law in every colony that every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 serve in the militia. If a militiaman cannot afford a rifle, one is provided for him. And they drill, and they have been drilling on a regular basis as the crisis with the Crown has intensified. And so these Lexington militiamen that courage stoked a bit by a period in the tavern before they came out in that dawn, are waiting. Many of them have already served in war. For the victories in the French and Indian War of 1756 to 1763 have been won with considerable aid from these Yankees. They bristle under the suggestion by British officers that they are not as good as regular troops. The British infantryman carries a rifle that is accurate, carries a musket that is accurate at 70 yards. Many of these carry rifles that are accurate at 200 yards. And they are not afraid to stand up to the fearsome charge of the English bayonet. And so the British troops approach. And the second in command, Major Pitcairn, rides up to the militiamen standing there on the green and says, "Disperse, you damned rebels." And that is what they are. If you resist the lawful commands of your government, you're a rebel. "Disperse, you damned rebels." And the commander of the militia steadies his men and says, "Do not fire first, but if they are determined to have a war, then let it start right here." And then no one would ever know what happened next, but someone fired. And then both sets of men fired at one another, and the British unleashed their bayonet attack. And colonials died there. One man bayoneted within the eyes of his own wife and their small child. And the militiamen are dispersed, and the British continue on the 9 miles to Concord. But the first shots have been fired. And at Concord, so the British officers carry out a reconnaissance mission as British troops begin to search for cannons, of which they find none. What they do find are some wagons, and they decide they will take these as a sign they've done something. Some 96 troops are sent further on in the town to where a small bridge goes over the river. And there, in the early morning, worn out from their march, they doze a bit. And when their officers awaken them in the late morning, not dozens, but hundreds of militiamen have swarmed to this spot. From towns like Acton they have come. And they come down over the hill and take their position on the far side of the bridge. The British troops, the 96, are ordered across. They form into what the British call street fighting formation to prevent a steady range and line of fire against the colonials. They know the accuracy of these colonial militiamen, the accuracy of their rifle fire, dressed as the colonials are in their round farmers' hats, long shirts. And then, again, the firing begins. And it is a ferocious blast from these militiamen that drive the British back across the bridge. 2 fall dead, and the third is dangling there on the side of the bridge. And one of the militiamen take the hatchets that the Americans are wont to carry and gives him a smash in the head, and the British shout out, "They are scalping us!" And the third British soldier dies. And now, with thousands of militiamen in place, the British begin their long march back to Boston, fighting every inch of the way, charging into the forest, calling the Americans cowards from shooting behind stone walls. Both sides suffer heavy casualties. And in these battles, in this war, to be wounded is almost as good as to be dead, with the minimum amount of medical care available. And the British, tired and worn, savaged by the American fire, stumble back towards Lexington, where they find 800 more of the King's troops, the governor having second thoughts and sending out reinforcements. And there, with heavy artillery, make their way back to Boston. The militiamen do not give up. Now, under colonial officers, with militiamen coming from Rhode Island and Connecticut and New Hampshire, they begin a siege of the British in Boston. And so it is. The first shot has been fired. There, by that rude bridge, their flagged April breeze unfurled, the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. I don't think that's trite poetry. I think it's moving. Because this was a shot that was heard round the world. And a generation that believed liberty to be the most important of all human attributes. Lord Acton, the British historian of liberty we have quoted before, said that the American Revolution was the single revolution in history that was started for an idea. The Americans were the freest and lightest taxed people in the world, and they risked everything for an idea of freedom. Behind them was that great English tradition of liberty, but there were also institutions that made it work. And as we attempt to grasp how the American Revolution came about and why it was successful, we turn to these institutions because think of the magnitude of the task. This is a group of 13 colonies perched along the Atlantic seaboard, taking on the largest and most powerful empire in the world, taking on the best professional army in the world that has proven its worth in the war against the French, with the most powerful navy in the world, the colonists having little more than privateers to put up against the English navy. But what they have are constitutional assemblies and a tradition of governing themselves. In every colony there is a legislative branch. And, like Parliament, these legislative branches control the purse strings. The royal governor is dependent upon them for his salary and for money that he wishes to spend. And it has been attempts by the Crown to narrow the control of these colonial legislatures over the purse strings. That has been one of the most sensitive of issues. For more than a century, most of these colonies, they have been used to governing themselves under laws that they set for themselves, accepting British foreign policy, but governing themselves internally. And this is the right that they want to maintain. Secondly, they have the tradition of militia service. To repeat, every colony has a militia law that every able-bodied man from 16 to 60 must serve in the militia with their own elected officers and trained to warfare through the French and Indian War. And it is these militiamen who will form the core of the armed force that will take on this greatest army in the world. So institutions of free government and a tradition of military service, much like the Athenians who stood on the field at Marathon, citizen soldiers. In an age in which a militiaman with artillery is every bit the technological equal to the soldiers of the king. But constitutional assemblies and militia laws would have meant little were there not statesmen and leaders of the highest quality. For the generation of statesmen who made the American Revolution is, I would suggest to you, in overall quality without parallel in history. Their names, men like Samuel Adams, born to some wealth, but his father losing most of his fortune, working his way through Harvard. The constant thorn in the side of the Crown, calling Americans early on to the defense of their liberties. His cousin, John Adams. Now, the quality of these leaders is shown by the fact that when British soldiers had fired upon a crowd in Boston in 1770, the Boston Massacre, and killed 5 colonials, no lawyer in Boston wanted to handle the defense of these British soldiers. It would be too unpopular. But John Adams stood up, took on the trial, won their acquittal. Because, as Cicero had said, even those who have done wrong, unless it is the most heinous of crimes, deserve a fair defense. Joseph Warren, he had made a fortune as a physician. His use of the smallpox vaccine during an outbreak in Boston had gained him a huge medical practice. Like John Hancock, he was wealthy. Hancock, one of the wealthiest merchants in America. Now, both of these men, from the earliest time of trouble, serve on the Committee of Safety. Now, when you sometimes hear from debunking historians and others that this was all about money and how not to pay taxes, these men, like Hancock and Warren, had far more to lose by taking the Patriot side The safest thing for them was to be on the king's side, even invest their money in British bonds, go to London. But no, they risk everything. And more than one leaders of this revolution will end their life poverty-stricken, having spent and lost everything for the cause of patriots. And outside of Boston, men like Benjamin Franklin, self-taught, self-educated, a printer, one of whose first books was Plutarch's Lives, educating himself, becoming one of the most celebrated scientists and polymaths of his age, worthy to count with the philosophes of France like Voltaire, and an early and powerful supporter, not only the idea of colonial liberty, but of colonial unity and of a United States. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, another of these wealthy individuals willing to risk everything. And then George Washington, that most incomparable of leaders, whose character and integrity set the United States on a course fundamentally different from revolutions in other countries, whether Latin America or France or Russia. Washington, the general, the statesman, the man. So these were the leaders who galvanized this resistance. And by early May, had organized a serious siege of the British in Boston. By June 17th, 16,000 colonial militia had gathered at Boston. And the British now found themselves besieged and were determined to break out of it. And so the governor, Sir Thomas Gage, ordered that a plan be developed to break this siege by artillery. Recognizing this, the leader of the colonial forces, men like William Prescott, understood that the key to any artillery bombardment was Breed's Hill and also its nearby neighbor, Bunker Hill. That if the British set artillery there, they could break the American lines. And so on the night of the 16th, American troops marched to Breed's Hill and began to erect a set of fortifications. And when the dawn broke, on the 17th of June, the British governor, looked out and saw serious European-style fortifications built to the designs that would be proud in France or in England itself. And he asked a loyalist standing beside him, "Do you recognize that American officer up there?" And the loyalist said, "Yes, that is my brother-in-law, William Prescott." Is he a good soldier? He is a good soldier who will fight to the last. And indeed, Prescott had laid out his lines carefully, ready for any British assault. And the British plan was a direct frontal assault upon this position. General Howe insisted that British honor and British strategic needs required an assault which would prove that the Americans could not stand up to regular troops. And let it end here. There had already been the attempt by the Crown to isolate Massachusetts, to pass acts putting enormous pressure upon Massachusetts and encouraging the other colonies to abandon Massachusetts. They had met with little results. Colonial assembly after colonial assembly had passed resolutions supporting Massachusetts. So now let the colonials see what British troops could do. And so the British forces were ferried across. Newcomers to America like General Burgoyne were there, also directing the operations. And the idea was for the British to march in their regular three-ranked assault. In full gear, weighing roughly 75 pounds, their brilliant scarlet coats, highlighted by the blue coats of the Marines, to march up the hill and take these fortifications. As they were landing, William Prescott, the leader of the colonial forces, drew out all the way to the water's edge, fence posts, stones, whatever could be used to make a wall, and place sharpshooters from Connecticut and New Hampshire behind that wall. Understanding that the British would attempt to sweep around by the flank, the right flank, and take what they thought was an unprotected side of the Americans. And so the British, in ordered array, drums beating, fifes blowing, began their march up that hill. And they were immediately met as they reached the 70-yard mark, stopping even to dress their ranks after they had fired. When they reached the 70-yard mark, a ferocious blast from the American rifles and muskets. And then as they got a little bit closer, thinking they were sweeping around the flank, an even more savage blast from the sharpshooters from New Hampshire and Connecticut. And the losses were staggering. Officer after officer fighting alongside his men, the British side, shot down. And the British troops first stumbling and then falling back down the hill. This cannot have happened. British troops cannot be driven back by colonials and by these Yankee Doodles. And so they reform, still in full pack, dressing their ranks, and begin to march up the hill again. And once again, they are met by this savage fire and are driven back down the hill. This is madness. The other generals like Burgoyne, Consul, General Howe, let us break off the assault. Let us bring up artillery pieces. Artillery pieces have been brought up. They have the wrong size shot for them. Let us bring up more artillery pieces, pound the colonials, and break them in that fashion. But no, it is now a matter of pride and of honor. It must be shown that colonials will not stand up to this assault. And so, a third assault is planned. This time the soldiers strip off their packs, strip down to their shirt sleeves. And by this time, the Americans themselves are running out of ammunition. The supplies and reinforcements that had been promised William Prescott had not arrived. And so now down to their final shot, the Americans wait the attack. And this time the British are told not to fire, but simply to come up the hill. And as they reach the American fortifications, to blast and then take it by bayonet assault. And that is what happens. Men like Joseph Warren die fighting. The wealthiest physician in Boston, dead. William Prescott, assaulted on all sides. His family would later show for generations to come his waistcoat and his coat bullet-riddled. And finally, the Americans withdraw, an orderly retreat. It leaves the field in the hands of the British. It is what military men would call a tactical victory, but it has been a strategic defeat for the British. Their losses are enormous, and the colonial militiamen now understand that they can build fortifications and they can fight with the best that the British have to offer. Because ultimately, this will be a question of defending freedom with blood. The idea of breaking with the crown is still a dangerous concept. But in fact, the colonies are at open war with the British Crown. And so it will be that on July the 3rd, George Washington will arrive in Cambridge, commissioned by the Continental Congress since 1774, meeting again as an extra-legal body with no supervision or accountability to the Crown, and certainly no authorization from the Crown. But Washington, the Virginian, has been appointed by the Congress as commander-in-chief of this Continental Army. And so, with the men who have fought at Bunker Hill standing at attention, giving them the salute of honor, he assumes command under the great tree in the square at Cambridge. Hearts and minds celebrate his outstanding ability. What a figure of a man, people say. To the British, he's one more colonial officer, good enough at one time to have been offered a commission, but can he really lead this militia filled with citizens, soldiers, and farmers to any kind of success against the Crown, its professional generals, its aristocratic generals, and its hardened veteran troops. 1 year later, on July the 4th, 1776, this Continental Congress will declare its independence. It will do so in words and in a document, not written just for that single occasion, but that will echo and resonate down through history, justifying in words and thought the deeds of these men at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. And to that Declaration of Independence, we will turn in our next lecture.